Well, it's such a privilege to be with you today. Thank you. I feel like I'm among friends. I think my head exploded with Dr. Petro's presentation just before, and it's speaking of transitions, it's been kind of hard to go from that to what I'm going to talk about today. But I think I've got things in order for you and excited to talk just a little bit. Well, it's Bat Week. I don't know if you know that or not, but it's kind of freaky. This week, I had a bunch of bats move into my attic. And so I've been dealing with bats all week long, and I've learned a lot about bats. They're amazing creatures. And I'm not just talking about a few bats, I'm talking about hundreds and hundreds. I got the video if you want to see it at lunch. And we literally set out one evening because they leave the attic at the same time every night and just watched them fly off. And it's just incredible to watch these things. But it's annoying too, because as a public health guy, and that's who I am, I'm kind of an academic, and that's most of the hat I'll be wearing here today is from an academic perspective. But there's a public health threat with having bats live in your attic, right? And so had to do some mitigation work, had spent quite a bit of time this week working on that, and I think we've got the problem solved. Spooky, right? But joke for you. Why don't bats live alone? Because they love hanging out with their friends, right? Kind of stupid, but it's true. And it really is kind of the major theme of my message today, that it takes a community, right? We've got to have friends. We've got to have people in our lives. And so I'm really about talking about prevention and even more about promotion probably today, and community and the incredible influence of our communities. And so I want to stay in that headspace for most of what we talk about in here today. But I think to kick it off, I've got a few objectives here that hopefully kind of drive the course. I want to talk just a little bit about my personal story, especially my personal story over the past year. And some of the feelings I've had with that. And I'll tell you, we wrestled with some of this at our table just a little bit ago, and what's happened even recently, and how I've been responding to some of my own students with mental health issues. And so I want to talk a little bit about that story for just a minute, but then jump into, okay, switch hats, right? I'm going to put my academic hat just on a little bit and talk about some of the paradigms that we think about when it comes to addressing mental health. These paradigms are often help us understand the root causes of mental health issues. And it's what helps us as professionals, at least in a public health sense, work on some of these challenges, right? So I wanted to chat about that just a little bit. And I think in Dr. Petro's language, maybe you could say these are GPSs for the bigger picture prevention world rather than for our individual lives, right? And so we'll chat about that for just a minute. And then reviewing some of the science, specifically some of the science that we've done through our labs in the Department of Public Health and the work that I've been involved with that speaks to some of the things that we can do, right? And then wrap it up with, okay, based on all of that, what are some of the things that you can do as faith leaders? And so just a little bit about my story. It was just over about a year ago where I had one of my next generation students die by suicide in a parking garage at the living quarters where they were living. And I was a faith leader over the congregation where this young lady had resided. And so I know that's starting with a glass half empty today, but it has really put my head in a space of questioning myself as a faith leader for actually a year. But at that time, I really started questioning. I had a lot of questions, and I was asking God about those questions, wondering what, if anything, I could have done as a faith leader. And was there something about the congregational community that I was working to shepherd that I may have missed that led to this particular tragedy? And so in the days and weeks that followed that tragedy and that sadness, I prayed and wrestled with God, asking him those questions. Lord, what could I have done differently? And what, if anything, am I supposed to learn from this? I also asked that question of others, trying to seek for guidance and understanding. And then interestingly, we had this conversation at the table just a minute ago, taking off my faith leader hat. I know you just don't automatically take these off and put them back on, but in my role as a university professor, I had a student come into my office that was struggling with suicidal thoughts. As we talked, all those memories started flooding back into my head at that time. Some of that ache and some of that urgency filled my mind, and another prayer. How can I prevent this from happening again? And so I pulled out my best QPR skills, right, and went to work, doing what I could, I thought, to help that student. And I think we're on a good path with that particular individual. But what strikes me now more than ever is that by the time someone comes or I become aware of an individual that is dealing with suicidal thoughts and despair and those kind of things, there's already likely been, I know everybody doesn't fit the same mold in these situations, but for the most part, there's been a long trajectory of pain. Probably weeks, probably months, probably years of learning and unlearning, silent suffering, distorted beliefs, loneliness, and unmet needs. And by the time as a faith leader or as a professor or instructor, they come my direction or I become aware of that, there has been a lifetime of water under the bridge. And while immediate crisis intervention is absolutely imperative and we need to be paying attention to that all the time because we are surrounded by individuals that are in pain, I find myself as a professor in an academic setting anyway, and I've reflected on this as a faith leader too, longing for solutions that are further upstream. And so maybe you've heard this parable just a little bit in other circles, but in public health, we often talk about this parable called the ambulance in the valley. And it goes like this. A village built at the base of a cliff kept hearing the sound of ambulances rushing into the valley. Time after time, someone had fallen from the cliff above. The people of the village did what they could. They trained paramedics, added more ambulances, and built a hospital nearby to treat the injured. But one day, a visitor asked a simple question. Instead of adding ambulances, what if we built a fence at the top of a cliff? This story today really is the picture of where my heart is. We absolutely need to have these intervention strategies that are downstream. We absolutely need QPR. We absolutely need to know what to do when someone's in crisis. But I long to know more about what we can do upstream to prevent it from getting there in the first place. Now, we may not be able to do that for everybody, but in public health, that thinking is absolutely imperative. And so thinking about upstream and what we can do is largely about my message today and thinking beyond the crisis, but what we can do upstream. So we absolutely need fences. And I think the question for us is, well, what kind of fence? What's going to work best? What are not only the prevention strategies, but what are things that we might need to promote as communities? And when I speak about communities today, I hope you would think about it in the terms of families, schools, and even our own faith communities and congregations, right? And so it's a bigger picture for me in my mind. So it might require just a little bit of a paradigm shift for us. And so as you look at this picture, it's laying on its side because I wanted to give it away right at the outset. But as you look at this picture, what kind of animal do you see that comes first to your mind? Just shout it out, anybody. A penguin? A giraffe. Okay, you see them both now? All right, so this is kind of simple. And you've seen these illusion kind of things probably before, but it represents a paradigm shift. And maybe it depends on whether you're left-handed or right-handed as to what you saw first, right? Because I did slip it on its side. But there are certainly two pictures of an animal here. Did you catch them both? Sometimes it's hard to see both. And so in a public health sense, I think we wrestle sometimes with the same issue. And especially when we are so influenced by healthcare when it comes to mental health and chronic disease and those kind of disease states, we think more about the downstream ambulances and less about what needs to happen upstream. So I suppose you would expect that as a public health guy, I was going to come preaching this message today, that we have got to move upstream a smidgen more if we are going to address the public health problems we face in our society, and mental health is one of the big ones, most serious. I think every healthcare as well as community health agency in our state has some aspect of mental health on their radar as their top three. So rock and roll. We got to go there, right? We got to think, how are we going to wrap our head around that? Apparently I've got a median that I'm missing, so let me click that off. All right. So some paradigms, just thinking about, okay, so how does this look if we're thinking about upstream, and how do we think about this? I know this gets into the weeds just a little bit on theory and stuff like that, but I love how the way Dr. Petros talked about it at the individual level, that, hey, it's like a GPS. These are ideas. Paradigms are ways that we think about the world and how we can address issues, right? They are sometimes, in an academic sense, we talk about theory, we talk about models, we talk about frameworks, but it's just the way we're thinking about things. And so what I wanted to do today is just to present some of those common upstream ways that we can think about when it comes to addressing public health issues, even mental health. And one of the popular paradigms that's out there in the public health world is Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. Don't let the title scare you off, but it's a pretty general, basic concept that helps move us upstream. You'll notice that the individual, you and I, as a person, is sitting at the bottom of this particular model. But we are surrounded by many different environments, and we could call them communities, right? But this particular theory or model helps us think about it. Think about how we are indeed nested within various communities, and that those communities have a significant, at least as we do the research and look at this, influence on us as individuals. So love this theory, and if we're not thinking this way, we run the risk sometimes of blaming the victim. I can't help but think about something like smoking, where, if you just toughened up and had more willpower, you could quit smoking. When in reality, we have spent the past, 20, 25 years going after the tobacco industry, one of those bigger circles around the individual, to help address the problem, right? Now, I don't think that excludes the importance, take away any responsibility from the individual to a certain degree. We do have our free agency, we do make choices, but those can often be very powerfully influenced by the environments in which we live, the communities in which we live, right? So that's this particular paradigm. And you will often see this idea reflected in other paradigms, other public health models. And so our behavior and well-being are deeply shaped by the many communities in which we are nested in. So that's my point today, right? It truly does take a community if we're going to want to tackle a problem. And for every public health problem or community health problem, there is a simple solution, people. that doesn't work. It's typically a comprehensive and a coordinated approach, and it involves the community. And so there you go. You have to jump out there on the key message right at the outset, but here's a few other thoughts. Y'all probably are familiar with this one. It's been around for a long time, and you first probably came across it in your Social 101 class or Psych 101, wherever it was, but Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And if you explore this particular model, you will notice how community is embedded in this model. The power of connection. I love what the United Way down in Utah County's done with this, and they recognized this is a powerful model, and so it's guiding their programming for strengthening kids down there. But that connection becomes incredibly important if we want kids that are going to flourish or thrive, or what else do you want to call it? Be mentally well. So here's one way to look at it, right? On things that we can do. You may be familiar with Hawkins and Catalano, and there's a lot going on in these slides, and I apologize. You can have them, but this is really the foundation of our SHARP survey in the state of Utah. So if you've heard about that and you've looked at it, then you're familiar with it, right? But this whole model, or this whole idea that drives the work of the community care that cares programs, the communities that care programs in our communities in Utah, is founded on this paradigm, this model, this GPS, right? And so you'll notice the ecological perspective here. They say community, but maybe it's easier so we don't confuse things to say cities and towns in this particular slide. If we're going to address substance abuse, delinquency, and all the way over there to depression and anxiety, there's research that shows there's certain risk factors, thinking about the glass half empty, that work to address those social morbidities in kids. Right? You can look down the left column there. There's a lot of them, right? And transitions are one of those. We're talking about that a lot today. Kids that are going through transitions can be vulnerable. So if we can help them through that time, and even mobility as kids move around, then we can reduce the risk of depression and anxiety. Cool. That's been a powerful, powerful theme of this conference. But notice what's going on in the family. A lot's going on in the family. And family dysfunction, again, this is looking about what's negative, what are the risk factors, right? That stuff on the left is predictive. Those are antecedents to all of those morbidities. I'm just rattling this stuff off, but I think the question is, okay, these are communities, right? What is it that we can do as faith leaders to address some of this stuff, right? Now, we've got stuff going on in our communities, and there's lots of expertise out there that can help answer some of those questions, but here's the model, here's the paradigm, here's the framework from where it's coming. In schools, what's going on in our school? If there's a lack of commitment to school at the individual level and we see academic failure, then it's leading to that stuff too, right? See, here we get into this idea. For every complicated problem, there's a simple solution. It's a lot of stuff. A lot of stuff goes in the pile, right? If we're going to work on some of these challenges upstream. Here at the peer level, who we're hanging out with, so important, but you see those things on the left, and what of those things are addressing adolescent morbidities. Now, it's pretty cool here that Hawkins and Catalano, these guys were like sociologists. They came out of criminology, and they all started their research and looking at this stuff with delinquency in kids. But over the years, we've started adding the social morbidity list onto this, and we've started, even with some of my research, looking at depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. And so that far right-hand column is getting more and more check marks as we do more and more research. More to come on that in just a minute. But they started looking also, or they also recommend that the glass half full is also important with kids, right? Prevention's all about, we got to reduce the risk factors so they won't lead to this stuff, but we also want to promote some stuff too. And that's these protective factors, and Hawkins and Catalano suggest that, all right, we've got protective factors at the community domain, family domain, as well as the school and peer domain. But you'll notice in here, there's a kind of a common theme between all of those. Kids have got to have, and when you say kids, we're talking with this model, adolescents, they've got to have opportunities for pro-social involvement. They've got to have rewards for pro-social involvement. So what does that look like in our various domains? Whether we're talking about families, communities, or peer groups, what does that look like and what can we do? So as a faith leader, I guess the question becomes, what can I do as a faith leader to help these kids have pro-social involvement and also be rewarded for that? Maybe a simple example as a faith leader is, dang, we got to get these kids involved in service activities. We got to get them out there working with other kids and hanging out with other kids and doing something for somebody else through service activities. Now, there's own personal rewards that come from that, but I don't know, as a faith leader, maybe it needs to go beyond that. As someone is recognized for doing something good in the community. That happened to me as a kid. I was in second grade, and I remember to this day, people, I was caught by a cop doing something good in my community. And that cop wrote it down, went to his boss, they created an award, and this was a really small town in Eastern Oregon, and I was asked to come down to the police department. They brought the newspaper in, they took my picture, they awarded me with the award, and rock and roll, right? My picture was in the paper. I was a second grader. I mean, I felt bigger than life because of what I had done. Well, Hawkins and Catalano would suggest that that's incredibly powerful, and that's a positive thing that we have to do in our communities. Now, how does that look in your faith community, right? How does that look in a family? And what are the other opportunities we can get our kids engaged in that are really positive? Those are questions for each of us to answer. So that's your Hawkins and Catalano model. But okay, here's another one, right? You're all probably familiar with it, and you've been looking at this research for the past few years, but you know what, people? This blows my mind when I look at the research on adverse childhood experiences as a public health guy and realize what all of this garbage, abuse, and dysfunction in the home, and all those kinds of things, what it actually contributes to in terms of health. And mental health is there too, right? The more of these things around the tree that an individual experiences before the age of 18, the more likely they are to develop all kinds of health problems, including diabetes and obesity and heart disease and mental health issues. So as a public health guy, I've been doing research lately. I'm not going to share this with you today on trauma-informed care and how do we integrate this thinking into our primary care system so that we can start working on this even more. It's tough because docs ain't reimbursed for that, right? So we got to work on some things. But incredibly powerful research, and it came out of Kaiser Permanente back in the 90s and CDC. So we know that there's something there. But as a public health guy, also, this particular author, Diaz, has suggested that, you know what? The social determinants of health, all that stuff at the bottom and the roots, exacerbates what's going on in the leaves in the tree, and we can't separate those two things. So this is really upstream, right, people? I mean, we're thinking about policies in our communities that are going to affect those adverse childhood experiences. Stuff like poverty, stuff like access to education, right? Stuff even like access to healthcare. That's incredibly powerful in my mind, but people, that is way upstream. And you may come to this conference today just going, dude, I was just hoping to learn more about how I could talk one-on-one with somebody. We know in the public health world, that's imperative and it's absolutely important. But do we blame the victim if that's all we focus on, right? So these paradigms, these models, I think help us think bigger. And they help us think the power, the impact that communities can have. Is that fair? Okay. Maybe I'm preaching to the choir and you're like, all right, you're not telling me anything I don't already know. I don't know. But this is the gospel of public health, not just according to Carl, but according to our profession. Is that fair? Okay. So I wanted to jump in this psychology space just a little bit because, a lot of you may be hanging out in this arena, maybe not, but psychology's went through some transitions over the years. If you're familiar with that, I got my undergraduate degree in psychology, and I got done, and I'm like, whoa, what am I going to do with this degree? And public health came along, and I rock and roll. The marriage is absolutely amazing because psychology helps us understand behavior, right? And behavior is at the root of most of our public health problems. Kind of a no-brainer. But historically, psychology has had this either-or perspective, and I'm really speaking here up until about 1990. It was a disease model, right? And so this is another paradigm. It's kind of in the past, but this is where we were at. You were either mentally ill, and if you didn't have mental illness, then you were healthy. Just like if you didn't have heart disease, you were physically healthy, right? Okay, we had that thinking, and that was going around. But it's interesting to me that it took until 1990 to kind of change that paradigm, to flip that script. Because actually Maslow, he's an older dude than that, right? Remember what's at the top of his pyramid? Thriving, self-actualization is what he called it, right? Being your best self. But he was kind of thinking from a disease or a negative glass half empty perspective and needs, which is all right. I mean, but he may have been one of the first to talk about flourishing, having that at the top of his model, right? Top of his paradigm. Anyway, we got this. And then a guy came along by the name of Corey Keyes, a researcher out there, and he said, no, yeah, we got it all wrong. We got to start thinking about optimal mental health and poor mental health on a whole different continuum. Because what his research noted is you could have people that were diagnosed with a mental illness and still be mentally well. Whoa. New concept. I mean, it just wasn't illness and wellness. It was like, oh, to me, that is incredibly empowering when we think of that. That I'm just not doomed to my diagnosis, right? That even though I may have had that diagnosis, I can still flourish in life. Now maybe it's a little bit harder because I have that extra challenge in my life, but I just love his thinking here. And this thinking has permeated through psychology, and there has been a shift, a real paradigm shift in psychology, which is pretty cool in my mind. So we're talking individually here just a little bit. We'll shift gears and head back to the community in a moment. But if you stare at this just a little bit, you'll notice that optimal mental health or flourishing on the top, on the bottom is something called languishing. And this is this whole idea that sometimes we can just get in a rut, that life's kind of challenging, right? And we're feeling what Keyes, actually it wasn't Keyes, it was another author, called during COVID, we just felt blah. And that can happen to us. The problem is when we stay in the blah stage or state, it can lead to mental illness in Keyes' mind, right? And some of his research. So even though we haven't been diagnosed with the mental illness, if we hang out in blah too long, we'll end up over there, probably in the mental illness, if we haven't already been diagnosed. I just think this is an empowering concept. And what it does is it puts us in the headspace of what can we do then to help people flourish? What is the things, the half glass full stuff that we can prescribe even? I was actually talking to a physician about this yesterday. Okay, you can prescribe the drugs, but can you also prescribe X, Y, and Z to help people flourish? Dang, that's a good idea. Let's get a whole nother prescription pad that will do that. I'd love one of those, that kind of idea, right? So anyway, love this concept of Psych 2.0, and it really is in this realm of what we're now calling today positive psychology. So you're probably familiar with it. Seligman, when he came along in 1990 and was the, what do they call those guys, president of the American Psychological Association, he's like, man, I had it all wrong here. I think there's a whole nother side to psychology that we got to be preaching more about. It's not just about mental illness. It's got to be about mental health as well and what we can do to help people flourish. So we won't go into all the history there, but 2 great books if you haven't tapped into those. Authentic Happiness was the first one. He followed it up with Flourish, and he says, you know what? There's 5 things that we got to do, and this is as individuals, but I think the community piece is embedded here too, to help people flourish, to help people be mentally well. Now, it's here because, to me, this is going upstream, people. This is going upstream, and it's here because community is embedded in what Seligman recommends. Relationships are incredibly important in all of our lives, and we've got to have positive ones. Without those things, we're toast, right? So these probably aren't mutually exclusive. They kind of flood over into each other. As a runner, that's kind of my therapy. I can see how running as a physical activity helps me with all 5 of those things, right? It provides me with a powerful community. Some of the best conversations I've had as a runner have been with who I'm running with, and actually, powerful relationships there. Now, it doesn't give me all the meaning and purpose. My faith tradition is powerful in that space. Now, Seligman would probably say, yeah, NFL, or maybe it's the Blue Jays. You guys been watching the Blue Jays? They're doing pretty good right now. Could be your meaning and purpose in life. But as a spiritual leader, that's probably not what you're recommending, right? So there you go. Those are the 5. That's what he's promoting. And what some of the research says is really powerful in helping us flourish. Now, Keyes jumped out, and here's another book for you if you want to check it out. He says, well, we got 5 vitamins. There you go. And kind of same, but you'll see community in here too. Socializing with others. But notice Keyes is a little braver and says, man, people have got to have engagement with spiritual practices. And as they incorporate these 5 things in their lives, the vitamins, they're more likely to flourish. Which, for our purposes today, is be stronger, healthier in terms of our mental health. Okay, so cool. I know I'm kind of in the lecture mode right here. I promise we'll shift gears in just a minute, but kind of getting through some of these because they're the foundation, really, these paradigms. My colleagues and I have thrown them at the research, right? We're trying to test some of these principles. Does this stuff really work? You know, what does really work out there? So some of the science that we've done, don't want to freak you out with some of these figures, but we'll try our best. Because as researchers, we've begun to look at these paradigms to see how well they work and what's most important in them for predicting mental health outcomes. Is that fair? And so I'm just going to throw just 3 of them at you. You can look at some of the other work that we've done, and there's many, many more from our labs. The familyhealth.byu.edu has a list. And then chs.byu.edu has another list of just published articles, peer-reviewed articles in this space. So the first one I wanted to show you, this whole Hawkins and Catalano stuff, we were really intrigued with this idea of, okay, yeah, this works really well with substance abuse and delinquency, but let's go down this rabbit hole of how does it work with suicidal thought. The state of Utah was pretty smart. They threw some of those questions in their survey of thousands of kids and asking them, so where's your head with regards to suicidal ideation? We simply took those questions as our outcomes and we asked the question, which of all those Hawkins and Catalano domains as well as individual risk factors is most highly predictive of suicidal thought and behavior in adolescents in the state of Utah, right? So here was our methodology. We used a machine learning approach, which I work with computer scientists. They're really good at this stuff. I don't do it personally. I'm kind of more of the, okay, here's the paradigm and here's a great research question, but can you help us do it? And we essentially took all 130 questions in that SHARP survey, all those domains and risk factors, and just threw them in a pile. And we told the computer, sort it out run multiple models, hundreds, thousands of different models to see which ones of those risk factors are most predictive of suicidal ideation in kids. And we used a number of different machine learning tools to do it, and that's what that graph is. Don't freak out about it, but the green one is the most predictive, and we were able to predict suicidal ideation in adolescents at 91% accuracy. You'll see that under the light GBM model, 91. Pretty crazy, right? Well, then the next, so number one, we could do it. We could predict suicidal ideation in kids using this approach. Here was the findings. Out of all of those questions, and this is by question, out of 130, these are the ones that jumped off the page as most predictive of suicidal ideation in kids, which is pretty crazy, right? You'll notice a pattern here. Two incredibly important communities are most important when it comes to risk for suicidal ideation in kids. The blue, peer and individuals, and then the green, the family. We just let the machine tell us this. We just threw it in. We didn't have any hypothesis. We didn't have any preconceived notions. We just let it run and run and run and run until it kicked this out and told us with 91% accuracy, here you go. So what was our conclusion on this? Yeah, and maybe this is no brainer to you guys. We talked about it quite a bit in our state and even in the nation, but digital harassment is crazy. It is so important. Actually, it's sad, right? We got to do something about that. But school bullying on the school grounds becomes a big issue. Now remember, our outcome variable here, people, is suicidal thought and behavior. That's a pretty big portion of why we're here today, right? I know crisis intervention and dealing with that is important, but if we want to wrap our head around this and do a better job with addressing it, moving upstream means those communities. What's going on between peers and what's going on in the family, right? I mean, this is prevention in my mind. We have to strengthen families. And you as a faith leader are incredibly important to that work. So what does that mean in your faith community? Maybe means something different depending on your faith community. But to Dr. Petro's point, it probably boils down to, it sounds simple, and it flies in the face of what I said. Love and connection, right? There's some very, very powerful stuff that goes on there. Second study, okay, the ACEs paradigm. We did some work on this, obviously incredibly intriguing, but we're thinking about kids adolescent age, but even younger than that have experienced adverse childhood experiences. So our question was, we wanted to explore that stuff. We also wanted to explore some of the glass half full stuff, what helps kids flourish, right? Positive childhood experiences, and how that impacts mental health of our college students. So we did a study on this as well, and this is where maybe we could talk a little more about the glass half full stuff, but this was a survey, whereas the previous study was secondary data. It was a pile of stuff sitting there, and we analyzed it. We went out and collected this with our college student populations, and we did some structural equation modeling to analyze this just to see how does PCEs, as well as ACEs, as well as even current stressors, influence somebody's ability to cope and ultimately mental health outcomes. Now, what are PCEs? So these are often in the literature, if you're looking at some of this stuff, called benevolent childhood experiences. And this is important, people, because we were kind of shocked by this finding. ACEs, we know, are a big deal. We know they contribute to stuff. But what this research helped us show, and additional follow-up studies that we did, was that PCEs is incredibly important. A matter of fact, well, there's this scary look at the findings, and I don't have my pointer's not working here, but what essentially this is saying is that all that predictor stuff is on the left. You'll see those boxes there. You see ACEs, you see PCEs, and you see life events, current life events. And all that stuff in the middle is just coping, all right? It's how we were measuring coping. The stuff on the right is all the mental health issues, which, okay, there we go. We had depression, we had anxiety, and that kind of stuff in there. It's the lines that are important and the little numbers which you can't see. But essentially what this is saying is that look at the very top box on the left, PCE scores. There's a lot of lines coming off of that, people. And they're pointing to other things. There isn't as many lines coming off of the second box. That's the ACEs stuff. This started speaking to us of the power of positive childhood experiences in people's lives. In fact, it is more predictive of flourishing than ACEs are. It actually helps to buffer. You may have a bunch of crap going on in your life, ACEs-wise, but if the more positive childhood experiences you have, it controls that stuff. It buffers against that stuff, right? And so the studies that we've done in this space really speak to the power of positive experiences more than it spoke to what's going on with ACEs. So this is the glass half full stuff. This is the protective factor stuff, right? This is what's so powerful in my mind is flourishing. If we want to go upstream and we want to get a handle on this, yeah, we got to figure out how to reduce ACEs, but more importantly, probably from a prevention standpoint and a promotion standpoint, we've got to figure out how to address those things. Right? Okay? So to us, this is incredibly powerful. And it speaks to if you look at these things again, the power of community. The power of community. So I'm not reading those, but I'm hoping you're just kind of taking a gander at them. If you want to look at them in the research, again, they're called benevolent childhood experiences. In some of our research, we've called them counter ACEs. But in this study, we call them PCEs, positive childhood experiences. So PCEs improved coping skills, which led to a reduction in depression and anxiety in college students. Speaks to the power of positive connections in our communities, whether it's families, cities and towns, or even in schools. Okay, there you go. Last one. Let's jump to this study, which is kind of intriguing as well. This one hasn't been published yet. This is hot off the press, and you're the first to see it. Please, do we have? Please. Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. His question is, well, what's the age here on positive childhood experiences? Same with the ACEs we were looking at prior to the age 18. Okay, younger than the age of 18 with this particular study. So yeah, really good question. Thank you. This other study, like I say, is hot off the press. And interestingly, with some of the research that's out there, there's a guy by the name of Vanderweel out of Harvard that's been talking about this. He's in that positive psychology space. He's all about flourishing. Matter of fact, he's done a massive international study called the Global Flourishing Study. If you want to check it out, the data's all setting out there, real powerful. But it's about the individual level. But he's come out recently and started talking about community flourishing and how communities can flourish, right? And what are the elements of a strong community that helps them flourish? It's kind of where I was hoping to kind of wrap things up today. It's like, all right, let's dig into that just a little more. And we got a cruise so we can do that. But really quickly on this particular study, we just grabbed a bunch of undergrads again. So this prospective, we collected survey data. We had 140 kids, our next generation that are coming up, and we measured community flourishing. We also measured, individual flourishing, that mental health stuff, the glass half full, how well are they doing on that flourishing, languishing scale, if you will. And then we stuck mental health outcomes as the longer term outcome variable that we were also interested in as well. One of those was suicidality. And we measured it with those three questions right there. And so really intriguing. Don't want to freak you out again, but here's another one of those scary model thing looking statistical analysis deals. When we did the analysis on that research, you'll see community flourishing on the left, and we measured it in those three piles: families, schools, and religious well-being, or church, or Vanderwill says, change it to whatever your faith community calls it, right? Is that fair? And so in our case, we just called it church. And then how does that influence your individual ability to flourish? And then how is that related to mental health outcomes? Seems like an easy study, right? Well, it kind of was, but the results were incredibly powerful. And you'll notice here, the dotted lines are the stuff that didn't make any sense, okay? There was no significant difference, if you will, because we threw a financial and material stability, I got enough money to live on in there, and that didn't come out. But what did come out was community flourishing is incredibly important to whether or not you flourish as an individual. And notice what happened on the mental health stuff. Suicidality was highly significant. If you're flourishing as an individual, then you're, well, here's the, there you go. How's that? There's the findings in a nutshell. If community flourishing is strong, whether it's school, family, or church, or synagogue, or whatever you call it, then individual flourishing is strong. And if that's strong, then we have a reduction in mental health issues in college kids. So maybe this is kind of a no-brainer. And I feel like you're back there saying, no duh. Well, that's kind of what academics do, don't they? You guys have been living this dream for years and years, and we're just trying to prove that you're right. And that's kind of what we've done here. And I understand that. And I don't want to insult your intelligence, but as academics, that's kind of what we do. And we have our own paradigms to kind of do that, right? And I've thrown them at you. But maybe there's some things that you can learn from the academic side of the house that can strengthen what you've already known for years. Maybe that's the point of why I'm here today. So our conclusions there: community flourishing through family, school, and church settings is significantly associated with individual flourishing, which turns to a strong protective factor against mental health issues, including suicidality. We looked at those odds ratios, and all those things were on the list as being strong. Okay. Oh, yeah, that's probably an important point. And if we're addressing those things, we are saving lives. Okay, so something to do. I'm going to shift gears here in our last few minutes together, which is about 10 minutes. Is that right? Okay. Probably talked about that stuff way longer than I should have, because this is really the meat, I think. It's like you might be asking the question, well, what were you guys measuring at those 3 different community levels? Oh, I got a handout on this. Do you mind? Yeah, because I think it might be easier to just look at what we measured. And then, because I don't have all the answers to this question, people, this is what Vanderwill says. But how does it translate to our faith communities really well? How does it translate to our schools? And you, as a faith leader, may be working with schools, right? You're certainly working with families, but even in your own congregation, how does this translate? So this come around. These are simply the questions, the individual scales, Vanderwills, for individual flourishing, and then on the back is community flourishing. And you'll notice it's broke down by different constructs, and here they are. You've got good relationships. Vanderwill would say a strong, flourishing community has good relationships, proficient leadership, healthy practices, satisfying community, as well as a strong mission. Okay, so those constructs become pretty important, at least in Vanderwill's GPS, paradigm, schema, whatever you want to call that thing, to community flourishing. So maybe we could just take a stroll through those pretty quick. Good relationships include things like close relationships. There should be close relationships, in his mind, in a community where people feel respected and trusted. And you might think in your own mind right now, because I'm going to ask you to do this anyway, how does this translate to the community that you're thinking about, whether it's your faith, whether it's your schools, or whether it's families, or whether it's some other community you're associated with? A flourishing community is one in which each person contributes to the well-being of others. A good community is made up in part, then, of good relationships, right? Okay, so, and then nextly, this other construct that's built into this particular model is proficient leadership. Now, I struggled with this one a little bit because they're talking more leadership, formal leadership, positions of formal authority. You as a pastor, you as a bishop, you as that faith leader within the community. This construct speaks a little bit more to that. But a flourishing community requires that we have good leadership. That doesn't mean that if we're not in those kinds of positions that we can't be informal leaders and influence these constructs. So if that's you in this group today, that's okay. Think about that. So our good leadership requires that authority figure, that person, cares about the well-being of those in the community. Now you're like, yeah, right, duh, that's really important. But not all of our communities have that going on, right? I mean, that's for sure. Leaders should have the skills and understanding needed to lead the community well and be of sufficient character that they can be relied upon. Okay, so check out the questions that measure this construct in the handout that I gave you. A good community there, well, also proficient leaders have this ability to inspire others, especially with a vision that others can follow, right? So that seems like a no-brainer, but proficient leadership is important. Healthy practices. So this is the idea that a well-functioning and flourished community will have healthy practices, and there should be structures and practices in place that allow relationships to develop, that allow for the appropriate handling of conflicts within that community. Maybe it's the family council, right? Or maybe it's your church councils that do this kind of thing. But good communities, well, also it allows the community to, practices that allow the community to sustain itself as well, to survive. So a good community is made up of healthy practices, as well as all of that should probably lead to a satisfying community. And this is kind of a pulse check. Communities should be then satisfying to be a part of. You know, people's perceptions about that particular group. People should have a sense of welcome and belonging. Now, if you haven't looked at that Surgeon General's report on loneliness, you got to go there. This probably lots of these constructs speaks to the power of belonging, the importance of belonging, right? But that report really gets into the weeds on the research. People think that it's a good community to be a part of. And so, in part, satisfying communities are flourishing communities. And then we've got a strong mission, lastly. Flourishing communities should be fulfilling its purpose, whatever that is, and whatever that might be. The purpose and mission is then clear, too, as well, to everybody. People feel someone is needed to fulfill the goals that everyone is needed to fulfill those goals and the mission of that community, right? And that they can do it together, and that the sum is greater than any one individual. So look at the questions on that sheet, and then I guess my question to you is, how in the world does this relate to you as a faith leader in terms of what we might be able to do, what we're doing in our own communities? So here's the question then, and this is it. Think about then one community you're associated with. And do you see that community, whether it's your congregation, of families, or whatever, do you see that community flourishing right now? Where are some of the challenges and pain points? And then what is something that we might be able to do to help that community flourish? So this is doing something, right? I mean, you're like probably going, oh, that research is kind of cool, but this is where we get into the weeds as to what we can really do with it and how it might translate. And in order to answer that last question, can we learn something about what Vanderwill, flip it over, Community Flourishing Survey, and all those constructs and questions? Can you look at what you can do through the lens of those 5 constructs? Should we do it for a minute? Do you feel comfortable enough, kind of like we did in the last session, of just having a convo at your table for a minute about this? And maybe it's about something else too. But there's my 3 questions for you. And I don't know, if we have time, we could process this a little bit. Want to take a few minutes and just talk? So where do you see you strong? Where are your challenges? And what can I do, or what can we do as a faith leader, maybe through the lens of Vanderwill, to strengthen that community? You good? All right, rock and roll for a couple minutes here. Oh, maybe you only have 1 minute. I don't know. Do we only have 1 minute? Couple minutes? Talk. You guys want to talk more than you want to listen to me. Take 1 more minute. Okay, you guys, thank you so much. If we had a little more time, maybe we could just open this up. If you have questions or comments even on anything that I've said today, love to talk with you at lunch. It's a tough place to be between you and lunch right now, I know. So I'm going to wrap this up. But there's my 2 conclusions on the board today. If you want to influence mental health outcomes, we must think upstream and ecologically, right? We got to think about our communities. It doesn't mean individual responsibility isn't important. It just ain't the whole answer. We know that. And that there are specific things that we can do to help our congregations, our families, and our schools to flourish. I know the work that I presented today is probably a no-brainer, But I think it validates the most important thing, and that's the work that you great people are doing out there. It is validating what you probably already know. And so maybe this is the message. Keep up the good work, right? Thank you.